Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great privilege to welcome you tonight for our presentation, indeed formally the last evening Nicholson Museum talk. Before I begin and talk about some of the things that we're covering tonight, I just want to acknowledge that the University of Sydney sits on lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The University of Sydney and the Nicholson Museum and the Charles Nicholson Museum acknowledge the traditional owners, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. Although this is the last evening presentation for the Nicholson Museum, there's still plenty of things happening. As I'm sure everyone in the room is aware, we closed the doors to the public on the 28th of February. On the 26th of February, we are having a party to celebrate the long tradition of the Nicholson Museum, and there will be invitations for you all in due course. The other thing is to say that our Saturday afternoon talk series will continue for the period between the Nicholson Museum closing at the end of February and the Chow Chak Wing Museum. I've got to say, where I'm standing, I can see it, which is actually quite lovely, but when we open at the end of August. So the first Saturday afternoon of each month at 2 p.m, we will have a talk, and I'm pleased to say that the first one on this forthcoming Saturday, the 1st of February, is my esteemed colleague, Dr. Jamie Fraser, on the Palmer Expedition. If you do not know the story of the Palmer Expedition, you are in for a treat. If you do know the story of the Palmer Expedition, you won't believe it's true. So I can highly recommend it as well. $20, that'll be, Jamie. But once we close the door, we will continue to have a series of talks, and you will receive invitations for those in forthcoming weeks as well. 2020 is a big, big year for the museums on campus because of that building. And what we wanted to do tonight was to actually acknowledge, in these final weeks of the Nicholson Museum being located in its current location, to talk a bit about the history of the building, of the institution, and of the collection, and most importantly of the really, really significant people who have been involved in it. I know I'm speaking on behalf of the two of them, and we didn't actually talk about this beforehand, but I know that all three of us do appreciate what big feet, what big shoes we stand in terms of the history of this collection and the people who have worked on it and worked with it as well. So tonight is meant to be a celebration of those people and of that tradition. Any history of the Nicholson Museum really does need to acknowledge the work of the curatorial assistant between 1967 and 1986, Catherine Lawler, who in the late 1980s wrote a history of the Nicholson Museum up until 1945. And that book, unfortunately, was never actually published, but it has provided inspiration for us and for other researchers. I will also acknowledge Michael Turner, the former senior curator of the Nicholson, who did so much work on the personal history of Sir Charles Nicholson, and I will be wholesale stealing some of his research for tonight's presentation. But as we talk about the history of the museum, what we've done is to divide it up chronologically. So I'm doing the beginning, Candace will present the early first half of the 20th century, and Jamie will bring us from World War II up until today. And I've titled my section Humble Beginnings because it was an incredibly humble beginning to what has ended up becoming such an important collection and such an important institution on the campus. But there can be no discussion about the history of the Nicholson Museum without talking about this particular man. And the problem is I've got 20 minutes to talk about someone that we could quite easily fill 3 hours on. Sir Charles Nicholson is desperately overdue for a biography. I'm not necessarily volunteering myself, but it's interesting that the more you dig, the more you find. And there is so much more that we can learn about him and about his reflection on the collections through his letters and so on, sitting in archives around the globe. It was on the 28th of January, and I've forgotten whether it was a Monday or a Tuesday, of 1860, 160 years ago yesterday, that Sir Charles Nicholson sat down to write this letter to the Senate. During my recent visit to Europe and on a journey along the River Nile, I was enabled to make a considerable collection of Etruscan, Greek, Roman and Egyptian antiquities, always with the contemplation of presenting this collection to the University of Sydney, and goes on to describe how he believes that the acquisition of a museum of these types of objects would be incredibly beneficial for the university community, but actually far more broadly for the community of Sydney and for the colony of New South Wales. There are many things we can say about the nature of 19th century collections. There are many things that need to be said about the wrongs of the way that some of these collections came together. But what is undeniable about Sir Charles Nicholson, and indeed what separates him from most of his contemporary collectors, was this vision of a collection not for a personal or private folly or fancy, which would later be bequested to a cultural institution, but quite specifically the intention of establishing a teaching collection. And it means that because of that underlying philosophy, he was acquiring objects in a really interesting manner and acquiring really interesting objects, which again, those of us working with them, but also many researchers from around the globe, continue to be quite amazed at how such important items have ended up in Sydney. As I say, there's much that can be said about Sir Charles Nicholson, and I guess all I can really say is that, in my 20 minutes, he was a polymath. He was a man of many interests, a man of many talents. But one of the fascinating things, of course, that has come to light in recent years, and this is particularly through Michael's research, is how little we know about Sir Charles Nicholson himself and how much he himself, in later writings and in later documents such as census forms and indeed his listing in Burke's Peerage, muddied the waters of his true ancestry. And we now know why. Through some really interesting archival research and family history research, Michael was actually able to prove that our beloved Sir Charles Nicholson was actually born illegitimately to Barbara Ayscough and christened with the name Isaac in the North Yorkshire town of Ugglebarnby. Possibly you can understand why he pretended he was born somewhere else later in life, just with that name. But it's a remarkable story because his humble beginnings really represent a triumph within the Victorian era, the 19th century, to overcome so many of those issues. But it also, of course, demonstrates that so many of the mysteries of Nicholson's personal story and personal life continue to be unknown. How did he go from such humble beginnings to a position where he became the first baronet created in the colony of New South Wales? It is a remarkable journey, and it is interesting to note that he doesn't return to England until 22 years after his first arrival in the colony, surely by which time anyone who might have known his family history secret has long forgotten or passed on. It is interesting that when he has his coat of arms created in the 1850s, that he uses a quote from Juvenal, from the Roman poet, that virtue is the only nobility. So he himself knew some of the stories. But of course, none of this detracts from the remarkable story of a man who was educated in medicine at the University of Edinburgh, graduating with an MD in 1833 and coming out to the colony in 1834 on the ship James Harris. Within a very short period of time, he remarkably impacts upon the colony. He serves on the New South Wales Medical Board between 1838 and 1851. He's instrumental in the creation of the Australian Gas Company and the Sydney Railway Company. He is elevated to the Legislative Council of New South Wales in 1843 and serving as Speaker for a decade, from 1846 to 1856. In 1860, he serves a couple of months on the Legislative Council of Queensland. And indeed, when he returns to England in 1862, does everything within his power to be created the Governor of Queensland, unsuccessfully. Knighted in February 1852, created the Baronet of Luddenham. Luddenham is now a suburb very close to Penrith, but was quite remote at the period of time, in 1859. And one of the areas of research that I've personally been conducting is the land holdings of Nicholson, which really stretch from Queensland right to Victoria. There are rumours that he was instrumental in the introduction of mangoes to Australia. But here in Sydney, his impact upon the cultural and intellectual life was remarkable. Again, instrumental in the creation of the Sydney Mechanical School of Arts. He actually served as the curator of their museum from 1836 to 1841, long before the University of Sydney. And this was a collection that included a library, plaster casts, natural history, ancient coins, and 60 phrenological busts as well, which, of course, from a 21st century perspective is something that slightly horrifies us. He was instrumental in the early foundation of the State Library of New South Wales, with the Australian Museum, which I'll come back to in just a moment, the Philosophical Society, later to become the Royal Society of New South Wales, the Horticultural Society. Nicholson Street in Melbourne is named after him. Ludwig Leichhardt named Mount Nicholson in Queensland after him, the Nicholson River in WA. But on top of all these things, it's worthwhile bearing in mind that he's a man very much of his era, with a wide range of interests, including spiritualism, which is another area of his interests that I've been doing some work on. And as many people in the room know, that in his 80s, in the later years of his life, he actually taught himself Hebrew. Much of what we do know about him is from his correspondence here in Australia with people such as Archibald Cunningham, one of the founders of Wollongong, where I come from, Alexander Berry, Leichhardt. The Macleay family, of course, would found the sister institution of the Macleay Museum here on the campus. Caroline Chisholm, William Charles Wentworth, Redmond Barry, the judge who saw and sentenced Ned Kelly to death. The MacArthur family. Internationally, he corresponded quite frequently with Charles Dickens. Indeed, one of the oddest lectures I've given in my life is to the New South Wales Dickens Society about Sir Charles Nicholson and Charles Dickens' interest in archaeology in the 19th century. Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Austin Henry Layard, the great Assyriologist, although interestingly they talked politics, not about archaeology to the best of our knowledge. Even William Gladstone, the Liberal Prime Minister of Great Britain, which coming from Sir Charles Nicholson, a confirmed Conservative voter, must have been rather interesting. So it's a wide range of interests. We see this reflected in some of the things in the collection outside of the precise boundaries of the antiquities, such as this fantastic silver testimonial presented by the Legislative Council of New South Wales on the occasion of his retirement. When I retire, David, I don't want one of these. But it is interesting, if you look at Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, up on the top of the globe, she is wearing a kangaroo skin. Again, a sense of the importation of the classical past to the new nation of the colony of New South Wales within the intellectual boundaries of the 19th century thinking. This was Charles Nicholson's vision, that the colony of New South Wales could only grow by understanding its European ancestry. And again, it's also, of course, very easy today to be critical of the way that they neglected or overviewed Indigenous history, but it's worthwhile noting that Nicholson himself did write a couple of papers, very small papers, on Aboriginal stone tools as well. So, again, we can be quite critical, but his mind was actually much broader in terms of understanding than many of his contemporaries. Even before the Nicholson Collection formed as an idea in his mind, he impacted dramatically upon Sydney collections. I mentioned the School of Mechanical School of Arts, but much of his plaster cast collection amassed in the 1840s was presented to the Australian Museum. Macleay Museum curator Jan Brazier has done quite a fair amount of research into some of these plaster casts, and it does seem to be that a number of them were subsequently donated to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and then in turn in the 1920s, as we'll hear later on, ended up back at the Nicholson Museum. There are many circles in this story. He was a patron of the arts, and again, his impact upon the foundation of a university art collection here at the University of Sydney should never be misunderstood. I also put up the medallion of his profile created by pre-Raphaelite artist Thomas Woolner, who actually lived with Nicholson when he first came to the colony. But it is probably through the University of Sydney that we see his greatest impact. He served as Vice Provost, today the Vice-Chancellor, for the first 3 years of the university's existence, and as its Provost between 1854 and his return to England in 1862. It was he who was responsible for the Royal Charter of 1858, which recognised the degrees of the University of Sydney as being equitable to those of other universities in the English-speaking world. And indeed, it is he who oversaw the presentation of the stained glass windows of the Kings and Queens in the Great Hall at Windsor Castle to Queen Victoria herself. And history records that she asked many questions about the weather in Sydney. He served as a Fellow of the Senate up until 1883, and indeed only ended his relationship with the Senate at that point in time because of an administrative oversight where they forgot to extend his position. But it meant that he would act effectively as the university's agent at large in Britain for decades, and most professors to be appointed in the 19th century had to undergo an interview with the old man before they were given the nod from Sydney. This included Charles Baddam, the second Professor of Classics, and Walter Scott, who would later go on to be one of the honorary curators of the Nicholson as well. But today, of course, and again, he was described by his contemporaries as the father of higher education in Australia. The official history of the University of Sydney will tell you that William Charles Wentworth is the founder of this university. I'm one of those, and I know there are many in this room, but I'm one of those who would actually argue that Wentworth, like all good politicians, took all the claim and did none of the work, that it was actually Nicholson who was the driving force, certainly behind the building that we sit in today. But, I'm running out of time. It is within our purview tonight to talk about antiquities and the creation of a museum of antiquities. And we can see his relationship with the other intellectual pursuits in Sydney really leading to this point. Between 1856 and 1858, he travels various places across the Mediterranean, but in particular down the Nile, and in particular various travels across Italy. It's worthwhile bearing in mind that he did go to Athens with William Charles Wentworth, and the two of them toasted democracy on the Pnyx in Athens, which is rather ironic because the two of them, as very conservative politicians, did everything they could within their power to prevent the common man from having a vote back in Sydney. But such are the ironies of history. But what we get as a result of his interests during those sojourns in Egypt and in Italy is a remarkably diverse collection of antiquities. And obviously we don't have time to talk about anything in specific details, but because of this interest in a teaching collection, he is collecting widely, he is collecting broadly, and he's collecting a really interesting range of artefacts and objects from various places he travels. The nature of the acquisition of many of these objects are unknown, and unfortunately, the thing that overhangs all research into Nicholson is the fact that later in life his library was burnt in a large fire, and any documentation, if it existed, was lost at that point in time. But there are particular objects and there are particular stories where we do know of some connection, such as, for example, the Armenian-born Joseph Haikian Bey, who was overseeing survey clearance and excavation at Memphis in Egypt between 1852 and 1854. Because of their personal connections when they meet in Egypt, we in Sydney are fortunate enough to have this remarkable limestone block from the Aten Temple at Memphis. There's also some wonderful, yet also slightly horrific quotes from this point in time of Nicholson and Bey actually sometimes rendezvousing in a London curiosity shop that sold quote-unquote Nile mud specimens, whatever that means. And also contemporaneous quotes of Nicholson telling friends, well actually telling Bey in this particular case, of buying inscription stones from Egypt, quote, of no use to anyone but myself. And that in many cases these stones he assembled with his quote-unquote geological friends to be ground down to hunt for microorganisms as well. So one of the downsides of that Victorian intellectual curiosity is that from a collection management perspective, it is horrific. The initial 480 odd odd objects that were collected from Egypt were sent to the British Museum for cataloguing by Joseph Bonomi. He would later serve as the curator of the John Soames Museum in London. The catalogue of Egyptian antiquities collected by Sir Charles Nicholson was the first attempt at a catalogue of his collection. This is before it even arrives in Sydney. Nicholson himself would actually write something of a catalogue, Egyptica, many, many decades later. It's an interesting book. It's a flawed book in many ways, but it is interesting that he continued to be interested in the Egypt long after he stopped travelling there as well. From a Sydney perspective, when he returns to the colony in 1859, now with the title of baronet, he takes up lodgings at Lindsay, a house at Darling Point, which still stands and indeed is a National Trust estate, should you be looking for a wedding venue. And it is within Lindsay that I think that some of the urban myths of Nicholson have become mixed together. Stories of dinner parties surrounded by Roman statues, which I actually think is probably a reference to his earlier home at Tarman in the 1840s and some of those plaster casts that were subsequently given to the Australian Museum. But all of the objects from the initial Nicholson bequest were stored here until 1860 when they were moved up to the University of Sydney. Now, in April of 1860, the collection was begun to be moved up. And much of the documentation of this era is lax or missing, but we do know that the university invested £900 on the building, much cheaper than we've spent, David, £225 on showcases, and £25 on moving the objects. The earliest public reference to the Nicholson collection are in two Sydney Morning Herald articles, published firstly on the 21st of September and then on the 20th of October, by a man whom we're going to meet again in a moment, journalist Edward Reeve. Reeve would be appointed the first curator of the Nicholson collection in December of that same year. But what we do not know, and there's no surviving documentation to the best of our knowledge, is what date the museum was officially open to the public. It's also worthwhile bearing in mind that the official name of the museum was the Museum of Antiquities, not the Nicholson Collection, although it was used unofficially and anecdotally. It was referred to as the Nicholsonian in some cases in the late 1860s and 1870s. One of the interesting things about the story of the Nicholson Collection is how much it's changed and how much things change as well. And what many people in the room are perhaps not aware is that the original location of the Nicholson Museum is not where it is today, but actually in a space in the next entranceway down, what has subsequently become known as the Oriental Studies Room and associated vestibules. So these remarkable series of photographs that I'm going to show you next represent the Nicholson as it appeared to visitors in the 1860s through to the 1890s. A remarkable treasure trove of antiquities from the classical Middle Eastern and Egyptian world, but certainly not falling within modern ideas of museology. Oh. Nicholson himself, of course, would move to Britain again in 1862, taking up residence in Hadley House in Essex. And I must say, from my perspective, what is interesting is a man who forms an archaeological collection in the 1850s, in an era before archaeology officially exists as an academic discipline. He gradually becomes an archaeologist. He participates in archaeological fieldwork in Essex and publishes with a number of societies in the United Kingdom on some of that work. He works on excavations in places in the UK, such as Romano-British sites at Viraconium, for example. And in 1864, actually works with a number of preeminent Danish prehistorians on a number of Danish coastal sites. And this includes a series of flints, which would be presented to the Nicholson Museum in Sydney much, much later in the 1860s. So again, he has considerable interest. He also has considerable interest in his wife. At the age of 56, he marries Sarah Keightley, a mere 27 years of age, so only 30 years difference. But the two of them would go on to have 3 children, all successful in their respective careers as well. And this sense of domesticity really pervades right throughout the story of the last decades of his life. His final house, the Grange in Totteridge, now north of London, is remarkable, and you get a sense of a man who is comfortable with what he's accomplished in life, sitting in a library like that. Maybe that's just me. But again, worthwhile bearing in mind that this library was destroyed by fire, and so any documentation that we may have had of his journeys of the 1850s and 1860s have been lost as a result. You'll notice, by the way, that the painting in the very rear above the window is actually a Conrad Martin's depiction of the quadrangle of the university. He may have never returned to Australia, but Australia was always with him. Meanwhile, back in Sydney, things were growing from strength to strength, and the appointment of Edward Reeve as the first curator was an interesting choice. He was a teacher, a clerk, a police magistrate, a journalist, a poet, and a playwright. His highly acclaimed play, first performed in Sydney in the late 1850s, garnered good reviews, apart from, quote-unquote, the intoxicated actors and the giggling ballet girls. He was quite instrumental in the establishment of the New South Wales Academy of the Arts, which would go on to become the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and he was paid a princely sum of £25 per annum, later £50, to be the curator of the Nicholson Museum. Contrast that with the $650,000 a year Jamie gets. His involvement with the museum is interesting. He resigns and then is reappointed, and I won't take you through the entire saga, but eventually in 1875 he would resign to take on the role as a police magistrate in Cessnock. His great contribution in many ways, however, was the 1870s catalogue of the collection, the birth of the idea of making academic sense of all of the things that Nicholson had collected and the items that were beginning to come into the collection later in the 19th century. We have gifts from Sir John Young, the Governor of New South Wales, in the form of coins. Charles Newton, C.T. Newton, a British excavator working for the British Museum in Turkey, sent a number of items. We have all sorts of items coming in, including Nicholson's additions to his original donation throughout the 1860s and 70s. The museum itself, in these years, reported up to 1,000 visitors per annum. A board of directors was appointed in 1863, but there's very little documentation to suggest what they did, if anything. In the absence of any of the curators in this point in time, the yeoman Bedell were the caretakers of the museum, and the Nicholson, indeed, was actually open on Saturdays between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock each afternoon, and during summers as late as 6 p.m. You could visit at other times by appointment, but only under the supervision of the curator, the yeoman Bedell, a professor of the university, or a member of the Senate. I don't need education officers anymore. I need members of the Senate to give tours. Children under the age of 15, according to the regulations of the museum of the 1860s, had to be accompanied not by an adult, but by an older friend. Unfortunately, much of what we could know about these early years, the annual curator's report that Reeve sent to the Senate, have been lost. But we still know quite a lot. And where I'm going to finish up on is the next catalogue, which was published by a remarkable woman, Louisa MacDonald. This book was a catalogue of the Greek and Etruscan ceramics and lamps, and it represents the additions to the original Reeves catalogue from the Nicholson Collection. It was beginning to grow and grow. MacDonald herself is remarkable. She was the founding principal of Women's College here on campus, amongst many, many other great achievements. But my time has ended, and it's time for us to move into the 20th century. What is interesting is in those last decades of the 19th century, there are some massive innovations in archaeology. One is the professionalisation of the industry with the appointment of academic positions. One of these is a man who would go on to become the director of the British School at Athens, Ernest Gardner, who had a number of bright, promising students, including someone called William John Woodhouse, whom we're going to meet in just a moment. The other thing was the creation, through the hard work of Amelia Edwards, of the Egyptian Exploration Fund as well. So I'm going to hand over now to Candace as we move centuries.
Indeed. So yeah, my section runs from around 1900 through to 1950 for the Nicholson Museum's history. But sneakily, I'm starting in 1888, not in 1900, exactly where Craig said, with the establishment of the Egyptian Exploration Society. It was originally called the Fund. It changed its name to the Society in 1914, and the reason why it was originally called a fund was that it was set up by Amelia Edwards to do just that, to fund research of Egyptian archaeological culture. Amelia Edwards had just completed her own trip down the Nile. She was actually shipwrecked, and she was supposed to be going to Malta and ended up in Egypt and went down the Nile and went, hey, this place is amazing. I can't believe how fabulous it is. How do I not know anything about this? What can I do? And when she returned to London, she has met with a range of different people to try and come up with a group of people to fund archaeological exploration. She was very good friends with Sir Flinders Petrie then. He wasn't yet knighted. And because of that friendship, she saw in him his drive and passion for Egyptian archaeology and thought that he would be the one to take on the mantle. And of course, it wasn't Sir Flinders Petrie, after all, who started it, but Edward Narville. And his excavations at Bubastis are some of the earliest excavations that were funded by the Egypt Exploration Fund. And it was the University of Sydney, through the wonders of Josiah Mullins, the founder of the Sydney Stock Exchange, who had also accidentally ended up in the Nile. I don't know how you accidentally end up in Egypt, but apparently it's a thing that can happen. And because he accidentally also ended up in Egypt, not planning a trip there, floated down the Nile and was wowed and amazed by ancient Egyptian culture, he returned to Australia via London when he happened to meet with Amelia Edwards. And it was this chance happenstance and chance happening to Amelia in the first place and then Josiah in the second place that something really wonderful happened. And we are lucky in Nicholson to be the recipients of this fabulous friendship. And it was that because he was so taken and he was a man of a lot of wealth, he was able to send £500 in the first place to set up and to begin the Australian connections with the Egypt Exploration Fund. And the first two statues that were received by the Nicholson, Ramses and Hathor, who I'm sure you're all very familiar with in the Nicholson, were some of the first items that were sent to us. They're definitely the largest items, but they're certainly not the only two. In fact, we had, for the first 10 to 15 years of the partnership with the Egypt Exploration Fund, nearly 600 Egyptian objects sent to Australia. And so by 1900, the images that Craig showed you before of this fabulous museum that you could walk around had already started to be overcrowded with pottery and overcrowded with the surpluses coming from the excavations that are happening down Egypt. And it was a burgeoning of archaeological research, and it was the beginning of what becomes the discipline of archaeology in the first place. So what you can see here on the tables laid out in front of you is a whole series of these amazing pots all turned upside down and sitting restfully on, I think, a tablecloth. But what they actually are some of the most really earliest pre-dynastic pottery that was found in Egypt by Flinders Petrie at his excavations at a place called Diospolis Parva. For any archaeologists in the room, you'll know how important this archaeological site is for the foundation of archaeology. This is where Flinders Petrie decided to try and date tombs and date the antiquity of the tomb by how the pottery overlapped in their sequences. He organised, in a way that no one had ever done before, pots by what they looked like, what their shape was, and how those forms could change over time. And by grouping these things together, by creating sequence dates, so starting at a known point in history and working either side, he basically developed a whole system that influenced our discipline for the last 150 years. And this type of pottery was fundamental to his understanding of archaeological research. And we at the Nicholson were lucky enough in 1900 to unpack crates and crates and nearly 400 objects from this incredibly important site in archaeology. But of course, archaeology just doesn't give you one time period, it gives you many, many time periods. And also coming out of the 1900 finds from this site were these amazing Roman tombs. And Petrie was not necessarily a Greco-Roman specialist, and that's my phone that's ringing, hooray. She was not necessarily a Greco-Roman specialist, but he undertook Roman archaeology and historical archaeology with the same mannerisms that he did for pre-dynastic archaeology. And that connection between those two is what really started and what got him the nickname the Godfather of archaeology. As you can see on the slide up here, what was really common in these days was to take photographs of tomb groups or photographs of material that comes from the same context. And what you see here in front of you is a whole series of material that came from one well out of the house of a Roman soldier, senator, official. The records are a little unclear about who this figure was, but he was certainly an elite and an important person living in the town at the time. And as you can see on the left-hand side, all of these artefacts actually ended up in the Nicholson Museum. And thankfully, the Egyptian Exploration Society have put all of this content available so we can all look at it on Flickr. And it's only through our current archival research and going back through these images have we been able to identify items in our collection. Because in 1900, if you're packing 400 crates of 400 objects at a time, and there was no assistant curator at the time, there was just one Edward Reeve, nothing was necessarily catalogued as it came out. And it created somewhat of a nightmare that we're still untangling today to understand exactly the provenance of all of this material. We knew that it came from Diospolis Parva, but we had no idea that we had a whole well until we found and connected these archives together. And so a lot of what I do and what we're talking about today is all this archival research that's so important in museums because it untangles all these stories for us. And because of the amount of material that we're receiving from the Egypt Exploration Society in particular, the museum had filled to its brim. And in the late 1800s, the University Senate voted to allow for some of the funds that had already been donated for the Fisher Library to also include a space for the Nicholson Museum. In its current position, it was overcrowded and stuffed full of artefacts and located in the Oriental Studies Room. And what was to be the Fisher Library was going to be this south wing of the University of Sydney where you see it today. Most people will know McLaurin Hall above us was originally the Fisher Library Reading Room, and the stack was actually the next, basically where we are right now, except straight upstairs. But of course, nothing moves particularly quickly when you're thinking about a museum build. And it wasn't until 1914 that this actual wing of the 1909 that this wing of the quadrangle would finish, and I'll come back to that at the moment. But the difficulty was, in 1900, that the museum management was not necessarily straightforward. As Craig mentioned, Edward Reeve had come in and out as the curator over time. Other people contributed to the research of the collection, like Louisa MacDonald. And in 1902, Frederick Lloyd was appointed as the curator of the museum. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1903, leaving yet another gap in the management of the museum. The museum committee or museum board had been appointed since 1897 with a whole series of professors entrusted to oversee the development of the collections to make sure that it was being looked after, but also to make sure that research was being conducted and that students were allowed to look at the artefacts that they were coming into. But it wasn't until 1904 that Professor William Woodhouse, the new professor of Greek at the University of Sydney, had been appointed as the honorary curator. And he remained the curator until his death in 1937. William Woodhouse himself had started work at the University of Sydney as the Professor and Chair of Greek in 1901. Before he came to us here in Sydney, he was already a very accomplished scholar in the fact that his undergraduate degree included working for the British School at Athens on the archaeological site of Megalopolis, which is one of the largest Greek theatres currently known. And because William Woodhouse had his basic and undergraduate training in the very early and new field of archaeology, he was always interested equally in material culture as he was in the ancient texts, which is somewhat rare for a professor of Greek at this kind of time frame. And what he did was quickly go and establish how, when he was here, to keep growing the collections. He oversaw the grand opening of the new Nicholson Museum. Unfortunately, as was written in the paper at the time, the museum, while it was divided to accommodate the Egyptian, Greek and Roman antiquities, on the night of the official opening was actually empty. It was used as congratulatory messages from other universities on the Jubilee, and it was a completely empty space. And as I said before, or hinted at, it wasn't until 1914 that the actual collection was moved from here over to here. And it wasn't until 1914 and the whole back area of the museum was taken over by what was then the Nicholson Collection. It was a mixture of some plaster casts that had been donated by Sir Charles Nicholson and organised from the British Museum and sent to us in Australia, as well as the different sarcophagi, sculpture and small cases for pottery, and the collections were there. However, as many of you all know, the layout of the Nicholson Museum, where we have the back room and the two front rooms, the two front rooms were being, I like to call, squatted in by the Faculty of Architecture. And they didn't move out of our museum until 1925. So even though that the museum was guaranteed in 1900 and the museum building had started, and that in 1909 we had an official opening with no objects. In 1914 we move in, but it's not until 1925 we actually take over the space and make it our own. And of course, just because a building is happening and the move is happening, it doesn't stop acquisitions flooding in. The University of Sydney continues through William Woodhouse and Josiah Mullins to subscribe to the Egypt Exploration Society. And each year you can see the list from the Exploration Society that Sydney, both the Nicholson Museum and the Australian Museum, were sent lists and lists and lists of artefacts from each of the different expeditions. We have material from El Mahasna, Abydos, Amana, Abydos, Antinoe, we have material from Oxyrhynchus. The list goes on. And some of the work that we've had in the Nicholson Museum you're very familiar with, but there are, as I said, nearly 1,000 objects that have been now donated to the Nicholson Museum through the Egypt Exploration Society, some of which have never been on display because of conservation reasons. We have things like complete children's leather shoes that need to be on display. We have inscriptions and cartouches of Ptolemy I. We have small pieces of Coptic textiles. We have fragments of pottery and faience, ibis mummies, pottery jars, all coming from our relationship with the Egypt Exploration Society. And it's through that relationship that we also get, I think, my favourite piece from the Egyptian collection, which is the floor fresco from the Marawatan complex that's been conserved and ready to put on display by our conservator Wendy Reed, who finished the work 2 years ago now. But of course, it wasn't just the Egyptian collection that Woodhouse was particularly interested in. He was a professor of Greek archaeology and of Greek history. And so one of the things, especially for the 1920s and 1930s, that he thought that we desperately needed in Australia was a plaster cast collection. This was the way in which we could study the great works from the Greek world right here in Sydney. And he set about and put in a lot of his own personal finances and petitioned the University of Sydney and the Senate to continue to help him purchase hundreds upon hundreds of casts. Now, many of them, including some of the sculptural friezes and some of the busts, were actually no longer in the collection. And that's because the invention of photography really did change the way that we all study archaeology. And most of these were donated to schools around Sydney. But some of them still remain in the Nicholson Museum. And the fabulous one of Bastet, which you can see on the right-hand side over there with the cat head, is still downstairs from the Nicholson Museum. You can see it now. And Nicholson thought that the plaster cast collection would be his legacy to the Nicholson Museum. But it's actually the 1800 glass plate negatives and photographs that he took of Greece when travelling that became his legacy to the Nicholson Museum. They record sites and archaeological sites throughout Greece. They record personal life. And I can go on and on and on about them, as I often do. And it's those that have become the Nicholson legacy. And I'll get to those in a little bit. But he was often travelling around Greece, taking the photographs and taking the plaster casts. And so when he was travelling and was on his year-long sojourn to Greece, especially in 1935, acting curators stepped in and looked after the Nicholson Museum. And one of our acting curators was Professor Frederick Todd. And Frederick Todd just happened to be the curator when Sir Charles Nicholson's 3 sons decided to donate the large Nicholson Hermes to the Nicholson Collection. Many people might not realise that the Nicholson Hermes was not a part of the original donation, but was donated in 1935 to celebrate the centenary of their father's arrival in Australia. And it didn't arrive as you see it today. It arrived in 3 different pieces. The right arm had been put on incorrectly in the first place, so it was a chance to change that. It had been grimy and full of a weird dark cement had been put on the stone in patches and required considerable conservation work and reconstruction. And it was then that Frederick Todd discussed with Rainer Hoff exactly who should be the one to conserve this artefact for us. And from the Technical College, Mr. Moorfield was assigned the task. And it says it all when Frederick Todd wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald that no one could have perhaps done it better, no one else perhaps quite so well. And it's a really wonderful piece to know that there's so many conservators contributing to the Nicholson Museum, as well as the curators and the assistants and all the other cataloguers and archivists. Throughout the 1930s, we not only continued to sponsor the Egyptian Exploration Fund, but the university then started supporting archaeological research further afield. And we were lucky enough to be an early supporter of the excavations at where the Woolies, as you can see in the very front photo, had just begun excavations of this amazing important site. And just like our deal with the Egypt Explorations Fund, where material based on our subscription was sent back to the Nicholson Museum, material was also sent via the British Museum to the Nicholson Museum for our support. And these include things like cosmetic shells, cuneiform tablets, thousands of fragments of pottery, as well as fabulous bronze works of some of the earliest in the region. Unfortunately, in 1937, William Woodhouse passed away of an illness. And it was up to Samuel Angus, who had already been working with the Nicholson's collection, to step in and take over as honorary curator. Now, Samuel Angus, some of you might know better as the Reverend and Dr. Samuel Angus, and he was an interesting figure in the Presbyterian Church. He had caused some controversy with his crazy ideas, like publishing on the pre-Christian religions and how they affected Christianity in the 1930s. But one of the things that Angus was really important to the Nicholson was doing was acting as an agent and talking to a range of different people around the world about their collections. And one of them was Deisman in Germany. And so what he did is he had this conversation with Professor Deisman, who had a collection of nearly 100 Greek ostraka, which are basically pieces of pottery with scribbled notes on them. The majority of them are tax receipts and transactions between people. This one I particularly enjoy because he's making sure that his friend fills up his wine jar with pickled fish. And they record a life in Greco-Roman Greece that's otherwise really unseen. And so they were an important step for the Nicholson Museum's collection. And it's because of Sir Samuel Angus and his relationship with Gillespie that they were actually then purchased on behalf of the Nicholson Museum, and it was 180 shirts. He was also instrumental in getting the Triggs collection, which is over 2,500 coins, that he, when Professor Triggs passed away, got his wife to donate to the Nicholson Museum as a place for safekeeping, and really began our numismatic collection, which now totals nearly 10,000 coins. While Samuel Angus was only stepping in for a very brief amount of time, it was then given the task of filling the role of Professor of Greek to Enoch Powell. Now, I like to think of Enoch Powell as our least serving curator, let's say. Samuel Angus had been putting in a lot of work for the collections and was still around during Enoch Powell's term, which lasted less than a year. He showed up at the Nicholson Museum and took on the Professor of Greek at the age of 24 and was our youngest serving curator. However, war broke out in England and he decided to leave the post pretty much immediately and turn around and head back. However, during his tenure, he organised for the acquisition of 5 pieces of papyrus from the Oxyrhynchus excavations of Grenfell and Hunt from the Egypt Exploration Society that were housed in the Fisher Library to be transferred over to the Nicholson Museum. And of course, a lot of you will know the one on the right, which is a fragment of the Iliad, which is an incredibly important and one of our most prized possessions at the Nicholson. However, it's not my favourite of the papyrus. The one next to it is actually a letter from a guy named Horayan to his brother Horace, complaining that he hasn't written him a letter back, and he has written him 2 letters, and he has been asking about his health, and it doesn't seem like his brother loves him anymore after all. And I quite enjoy that there is this fabulous piece of the Iliad that next to this quite whiny letter between family, and it shows you the breadth of what we really do have in the Nicholson collection. And of course, because Enoch Powell vacated the chair quite quickly, we were lucky enough that the New Zealand-born scholar Arthur Dale Trendle was able to take up the professorship of Greece. And maybe there are a whole range of people that have impacted the Nicholson Museum, but Arthur Dale Trendle is one of those figures that everybody talks about with such respect and such love of how much he really did for not only the Nicholson collection, but for collections Australia-wide. Our archives are full of correspondences between Trendle and other institutions that not only when he was acquiring a range of material for the Nicholson Museum, he also made sure that other universities around Sydney and around Australia and around New Zealand had access to the same markets and were aware of what was coming up. He wasn't just interested in the Nicholson collection, although that is definitely where the majority of materials went. He was interested in making sure that everybody was able to share in Greek and Italian culture. And so Trendle's acquisition program really began in the early 1940s. The war was still going on, and many of you will recall this story from Michael Turner's 50 Objects, 50 Stories exhibition, in which the three white ground lekythoi, some of his first purchases for the Nicholson Museum, thought lost at sea, captured by or downed by an enemy, down by the enemy, I think is what he calls it, actually showed up at the Nicholson Museum on the wrong ship, and we were lucky enough to still acquire them. But it wasn't just these three, but rather a whole range of South Italian pottery, as well as other Greek and Italian materials, was sent to the Nicholson Museum. Now, Dale Trendle was one of the most amazing figures for what's called attribution studies, where you look at a picture and you're able to, by studying the minute details of every single element in these paintings, attribute them to an artist's hand. It's following the work of Beazley, but he also worked with a woman named Noel Oakeshott, who was acting as our agent in London, and he was constantly corresponding with her, and she was the one that often went to the sale houses for us and corresponded with Arthur Dale Trendle to make sure that the Nicholson was getting the very best material, including the Tarpally crater, which I only just found out that she actually named, the Tarpally painter. And the other thing that Trendle really set up for the Nicholson collection beyond the actual objects themselves was the museum assistant role. Many curators had lobbied the Senate beforehand to create a position to ensure that things like cataloguing, unpacking, and really researching the collection could continue on. And the very first museum assistant was Liska Woodhouse, William Woodhouse's daughter. And she not only came to become the museum assistant, but she also then had the horrifying task of cataloguing her father's uncatalogued collection of more than 600 sherds from a range of places around Greece and more than 400 lead figurines from the site of Artemis Orthia at Sparta. The second museum assistant, Max Lepetit, as you can see, served for a very short time, and that's because at the age of 24, he very sadly passed away due to an illness. However, his legacy has always lived on in the Nicholson Museum, not only through an artefact that was purchased and named in honour of him, but also through the Max Lepetit Jones Prize. So Max Lepetit, Gwyneth Jones, his fiancée, although they never married, remained in love with Max until the very end in 2012. And in his honour set up a prize for the Nicholson Museum for the best undergraduate student to complete a work on any aspect of the Nicholson collections. And we've given away 2 of those now, the last one being last year to Marty Kennedy. And the culmination of this work and what Max was working on with Dale Trendle and what Dale Trendle really appreciated with Max's help was not only the complete recataloguing of the Nicholson Museum, but the researching of a significant amount of pieces to really update the very first catalogue produced by Edward Reeve. Nothing had really been produced on the collections itself. And so they produced the handbook to the Nicholson Museum at 271 pages long. This also came with reintroducing the collections, revaluing everything, making sure that the collections actually were labelled in the museum, as some of our archives say. And in 1945, the first edition was released. However, in 1945, the Friends of the Nicholson Museum was also established. And in 1946, the very first artefact was purchased with the Friends of the Nicholson Museum's help. And as you can see, is this fabulous Attic black figure where Heracles and the Erymanthean boar are about to get stuffed is about to stuff the Erymanthean boar into a pithos. And this very first purchase of the Nicholson Museum, by the Friends of the Nicholson Museum by the Friends of the Nicholson Museum for the collection was the first of many. And it wasn't just the Friends of the Nicholson Museum, but between 1945 and 1947, the collection swelled immeasurably. And that's due to not only the work of Dale Trendall, but also to the new Professor of Archaeology, James Rivers Barrington Stewart. And because of his association with the Nicholson in the very first year that he was appointed to the University of Sydney, the Handbook to the Nicholson Museum's second edition was printed in 1948, and you'll notice that it is swelled by nearly 200 pages in those 2 short years. And that shows you exactly how much transformation this late 1940s acquisition boom had taken hold at the Nicholson Museum. And because of that, not only did they reorder the Nicholson, as you can see, to this fabulous case layout provided for you, but also made sure that new cases were purchased, new objects were laid out. They were organised by rooms according to Greek, Etruscan, Roman, and into the prehistoric period of Cyprus. And that's where I'm going to leave it.
Okay, we're 2/3 of the way through. You're doing extraordinarily well. Please bear with me. I know myself, so in an effort to try and keep to time, I have written some notes, so indulge me. The university campus was an incredibly dynamic place in the years following the Second World War. The federal government took the frankly inspired decision to grant returned servicemen free education, and enrolments at the university swelled to almost 10,000 students. Now, this is an extraordinary figure, not only making Sydney University the largest in Australia, but its undergraduates' enrolments eclipsed most universities in the United Kingdom, including Cambridge. So Dale Trendall saw in this situation the opportunity to found Australia's first Department of Archaeology, which he did in 1949. The department celebrated its 70th birthday last year. To help realise this vision, Trendall appointed Jim Stewart, first as teaching fellow in the Department of History in 1947, then senior lecturer in the brand spanking new Department of Archaeology in 1949. A Cambridge-educated Australian, Stewart is the next in our luminary Nicholson figures. In 1954, he became honorary curator of the museum, and in 1960 was appointed the first Edward Cuthbert Hall Professor of Middle Eastern Archaeology. To Stewart, and indeed to Trendall, the Nicholson Museum provided the heart of the new archaeological department, a training ground par excellence for its students. As Stewart would later write to the University Senate in words that I think Nicholson himself would have been proud, the museum is as important to us as a laboratory is to chemistry. One of my favourite objects in the collection is this small Corinthian araballos depicting panthers and a sphinx. It was purchased through funds raised by the very first class of undergraduate students in archaeology in 1949. However, the museum was still a particularly Victorian piece of dust around which the pearl of the archaeological department would grow. When Stewart first arrived in 1947, he found a storeroom that had swollen suddenly but erratically with new acquisitions, this boom, as Candace said, particularly through the Egyptian Exploration Society. For example, in a letter to his wife, Eve, Stewart recounted finding a box of ceramic vessels partially open on the storeroom floor with a mouldering note scrawled simply, 10 pots, Amarna, Egypt, sent 1920. The Egyptian problem is quite overwhelming, Stewart continued, whose expertise and whose heart always lay in Cyprus. I hate the Egyptian muck and don't know much about it. The storeroom issue would not be addressed until the appointment of Stewart's successor, to whom we shall soon return. However, Stewart shone in the drive to expand the international scope of the collection. To develop the museum into a successful teaching laboratory, it needed to represent a broad range of ancient cultures. To Stewart, Australia itself contained little of archaeological value, and he looked towards European, Mediterranean and Middle Eastern horizons. As you have heard, this leitmotif had resonated through the galleries since the museum's inception. Nevertheless, Stuart expanded a campaign instigated by Trendle to write to museums across the world requesting artefacts for teaching. The government of India, for example, agreed to donate the Nicholsons only Indus Valley artefacts. A delay in their dispatch saw them fall under the jurisdiction of the new government of Pakistan following partition, who agreed, fortunately, to honour the donation. Stuart frequently offered Aboriginal objects in exchange, drawing on collections held by the university's Department of Anthropology. One such exchange saw the Iraq National Museum swap artefacts from Sir Leonard Woolley's excavations at the Royal Cemetery of in exchange for some indigenous spears, a throwing stick, a grass skirt, and a couple of coconut shells. I often wonder what happened to the coconut shells when the Iraq Museum was looted in 2003. The European axe heads you see here were obtained from a museum in Denmark in exchange for these Aboriginal artefacts, including a bark painting and ceremonial spear. But perhaps Stuart's greatest legacy was the expansion of the museum's Cypriot collection. Building on an initial acquisition of objects from the Cesnola collection, Stuart donated materials that he had himself excavated from Bronze Age cemeteries such as Vunos, or that would be excavated by his student and later professorial successor, Basil Hennessy, at Stefania. These objects were well provenanced and legally exported under the rule of division. Now, division stipulated the terms under which foreign teams working in Cyprus divided their finds into two groups at the end of each season, one of which would remain in country after selection by a government official, the other being exported to the country who sponsored the dig. And in addition to this, Stuart purchased objects diligently and extensively from the local antiquities market. The Nicholson Museum now boasts one of the best collections of Cypriot materials outside of Cyprus itself or outside of the major larger museums such as the British Museum or the Met. The terms of division were not restricted to Cyprus, but were legislated by governments across the Middle East. Trendle and Stuart used this system to build the collection with well-provenanced materials by sponsoring British digs in Cyprus, the Levant, and Mesopotamia in exchange for a share of the finds. For example, the university paid £1,000 for a group of ivory inlays that Sir Max Mallowan had excavated at the Assyrian capital of Nimrud. Similarly, they sponsored, for a more modest sum of £50, the museum, Kathleen Kenyon's excavations at Jericho near the Dead Sea. In exchange, the museum received finds such as one of only 9 plastered Neolithic skulls from the site, a Duck Righton vessel from a Canaanite palace, and objects from Bronze Age tombs. Now, it's important to reflect, I think, on the ambition and scope behind this acquisition policy. Sure, by sponsoring these digs, Trendle and Stuart were bringing objects to Australia that would otherwise never have crossed our shores. But in so doing, they were realising a grander vision of creating a museum of international standing in a university that was only 100 years old and in a nation that was not much older. But I think we can push the significance of this policy even further, as it represents a clarity of vision that perhaps only a new world curator could bring to an old world tradition. Now, as many of you know, I served previously as the temporary curator for the Levant at the British Museum. So I was astonished to find, when arriving in Sydney, that the Jericho materials sent to the Nicholson Museum far outstripped, in both quantity and quality, the Jericho materials that had been sent to the BM. I believe this situation suggests that Stuart had persuaded Jericho director and personal friend Kathleen Kenyon that Australia offered the best chance for the long-term survival of materials as, and I quote Stuart, war insurance. An issue that's easy to understand in the earlier nuclear age, perhaps, especially considering a Europe recovering from its second major war in 30 years. As Stuart would write to his wife Eve, and I think this is an extraordinary quote, "Another war is coming, when nobody knows. In it, Britain, Western Europe and the Mediterranean will be wrecked utterly and completely. We want to raise our standard of culture here to meet what will be, perhaps in 50, perhaps in only 2 years. And we want a centre of research on which future generations can build. It could well be the only centre of archaeological research anywhere in the world. In 1960, during Stuart's tenure, the museum celebrated its centenary with a special exhibition held in the University War Memorial Gallery, which until recently was the University Art Gallery. The exhibition was particularly notable for the display of a gold torque discovered in a peat bog in Ireland in 1857 and whose recent acquisition reflected the Nicholsons' increased interest in early European archaeology. The European collections would continue to expand through museum-to-museum exchanges following the appointment of European and Celtic specialist Vince McGaw as lecturer in 1961. The following year, in 1962, saw the new appointment of another senior lecturer, this time in classical archaeology, Dr. Alexander Cambitaglu. Although Stuart was still honorary curator, his health was failing, and a few months after Cambitaglu's arrival, Stuart died of hypertension and cardiac failure. He was only 48. Cambitaglu was thrust quickly into the role of acting curator, then, in 1963, honorary curator of the Nicholson Museum, and soon Professor of Archaeology. Cambitaglu found a museum with extraordinary depth, but needing significant attention. Although Trendle had arranged the collection to accord with his seminal handbook, the galleries had not yet shaken off their Victorian dust. Now, I've quoted Diana Wood-Conroy before. I'll do it again, and she's here tonight. She was a student in the early 1960s who said, "The museum had a marvellous musty smell of age, dark stone walls, Gothic arched windows, heavy wooden cases, and a great crowd of peculiar objects. The aesthetic was that of a Victorian drawing room." For years, Stuart had petitioned the University Senate to provide a new space to allow the collection to breathe. When Cambitaglu realised that this ambition would not be realised, at least not then, he closed the museum from 1962 to 1966 to reconfigure the gallery space as a new, thoroughly contemporary museum. This ambitious reinvention would fundamentally change the layout, tenor and tone of the museum well into the 2000s. The new and improved Nicholson Museum opened on the 23rd of September 1966 with speeches by Professor Cambitaglu, who overviewed the transformation, and Professor Trendle, who was invited back from a new appointment in Canberra to declare the museum open. We are fortunate to have the transcript of these speeches in our archives, and they illuminate the scale of this achievement, or as Trendle dubbed it, Operation Phoenix. You may have heard me draw on these before, so I beg your indulgence to cite them again, but I think it's worthwhile. Our first difficulty, Cambitaglu reflected in his 1966 speech, was to prepare a modern display in a building that does not lend itself to the needs of a modern museum. The long rows of Gothic windows were sealed to focus attention on the objects themselves. The high ceilings were lowered to reduce what Cambitaglu described as the barn-like effect of the open hall. New glass cases were introduced. The Nicholson Museum, and I quote again, is first and above all a teaching collection, Cambitaglu declared, and the new displays followed didactically the chronologies and geographies of the regions the collections represent. Just as importantly, Cambitaglu helped oversee in 1962 a stocktake of the entire collection, the most important in the museum's history since the accession of Nicholson's original donation. This stocktake addressed the thousands of objects that had lain unregistered in the stores, including the influx in the 1940s and 50s of material from Cyprus, Egypt and the Middle East, including those 10 Egyptian pots that Stuart had stumbled across a decade before. Trendle generously described the transformation as a fairy tale, revealing as it does, he said, so much beauty that was previously hidden from us beneath a disguise. To me, reading through these 1966 speeches, I am most struck by Professor Cambitaglu's ambition and foresight to create something beyond itself. Acknowledging the difficulties his team had faced, many of which are quite familiar to us at the moment, he remarked, "It is only because of our faith that we were contributing something important to our university, to the city of Sydney, and indeed to Australia, that we had the strength to carry out our task. Since there is no other museum of antiquities of this magnitude in the country, the Nicholson Museum's importance extends beyond this university's grounds. It is the Australian National Museum of Antiquities." Over the next few years, Professor Cambidoglu augmented his displays with detailed handbooks of the collections, and formal publications followed. In 1995, Cambidoglu co-edited with his assistant curator then, Dr. Ted Robinson, the volume Classical Art in the Nicholson Museum, the first major work on the classical collection since Trendle's handbooks. In 2008, Cambidoglu authored with Michael Turner the first fascicule of the Corpus Versorum Antiquorum of the Nicholson Museum, the Red Figure Pottery of Apulia. That was followed in 2014 with the second volume, Red Figure and Overpainted Pottery of South Italy in the Nicholson Museum. In addition to his scholarship, Professor Cambidoglu built the community of people that must surround a museum and make it come alive. While Trendle had created the Society of the Friends of the Nicholson Museum in 1956, it had been somewhat neglected following his departure. Cambidoglu revitalised the society while also founding the Association of Classical Archaeology, later becoming the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens. Both organisations banded together to sponsor the famous Nicholson Museum music concerts, which were held annually in the Great Hall between 1971 and 1995. Featuring top international musicians, these concerts were a key feature in the cultural landscape of Sydney, energising the museum and its community, encouraging people to visit the galleries and consider making donations and bequests to enhance its collections. Cambidoglu acquired funds to continue to expand the collection, often with the help of the Friends. Some of the most significant acquisitions include the bust of Claudius, a fine portion of an attic grave stela, the celebrated Cycladic figurine, and an antimonys amphora depicting one of the labours of Heracles. After 37 years, Professor Cambidoglu stepped down as honorary curator in 2000. In October 2018, we honoured his contribution by unveiling the Cambidoglu amphora, one of our newest acquisitions. This black-figured amphora depicts Ajax carrying the body of Achilles from the battlefield of Troy. It is by the antimonys painter, the same painter who created the antimonys vase that Cambidoglu had acquired in 1977. Professor Cambidoglu died in November last year. The unveiling of the Cambidoglu amphora was the last time he visited the Nicholson Museum. There were several unsung heroes under the Cambidoglu regime, notably his curatorial assistant. I mentioned Ted Robinson once, who was a curatorial assistant in the 1980s to 90s. Ted recounts in one of our Muse magazines a fire that had struck the top part of the quadrangle in 1989. Fearing danger to the collection, the Pediashicat coffin was gathered up and walked across the quadrangle while objects were taken out of the front room and stacked up around the back. Ted says one sheepish student emerged the next day who had put by mistake a small bronze Etruscan horse in his pocket and fessed up in his office following. Dr. Karen Suwada then took over as curatorial assistant in the late 1990s to the early 2000s. One of her major achievements was the first mummy project that the Nicholson Museum underwent, X-raying and CT scanning some of the mummies. In early 2000, a major refurbishment of part of the gallery and its storerooms was undertaken, particularly for the floors, leading to the Pella to Petra exhibition, featuring a lot of the university's own excavated materials in Jordan in August 2001, Karen's final exhibition. One of the most significant, however, restructures was more administrative than it was physical, or at least up till this point. In 2003, David Ellis became the new director of Sydney University Museums, which saw the Nicholson Museum, Macleay Museum and the university's art gallery come together as Sydney University Museum. Each of these collections was appointed a senior curator. In 2005, Michael Turner became the first senior curator at the Nicholson Museum. The position of honorary curator continued to be held by faculty, this time by Professor Daniel Potts, the Middle Eastern professor as a successor to Basil Hennessy and ultimately Stewart, although he stood down in 2007 and the position became redundant. Today, the Sydney University Museums sit as professional staff under the Vice Principal of External Relations. Now, under the tremendous verve of Michael and his team, the Nicholson really saw its most significant changes to the gallery since 1960, both in appearance and in operation. The galleries were reconfigured, reorganised, repainted to give them a new contemporary slickness that still does them well today. Michael's perhaps greatest contributions were an endless array of remarkable exhibitions which he produced with frequency and imagination. 50 Objects, 50 Stories, Faces of Power, Nicholson Man and Museum, Unearthed Tales, to name a few. But Michael, under David's leadership, also courted a significantly broader audience than that held beyond the museum's walls or the campus grounds. And I think you can see the success of this in his instigation of several Lego models. The first of which, the Athenian Acropolis, was requested by the new Acropolis Museum and is now the only non-artefact to sit in that museum that is not from the Acropolis itself. And currently the Lego Pompeii is seen, you can see, in the gallery. The museum, under this philosophy, went from strength to strength. The school program run so well by Craig Barker was turning schools away because we simply couldn't fit them in. In 2003, Michael's first year, 15,000 people came through the doors of the Nicholson Museum. In 2016, his last, we had over 100,000 visitors, which is quite simply extraordinary. And really it's this success which has helped underscore the case for a new museum. As Stewart had argued back in the 1950s, we have simply outgrown this space where we are at the moment. And with the number of people and the number of schools coming through, the Chow Chak Wing Museum, which will open in August this year, just over there, will help us realise these ambitions. The opportunities are manifold and I hope obvious now that you've heard the trajectory of the museum over the last 160 years. To me, the most powerful argument for this museum is the combination of collections. I spoke about the leitmotif of Stewart and Nicholson and others casting back to Europe and the Mediterranean to seek the origins of civilization. This is inappropriate in today's modern society. We must contextualise these collections as part of a global collection and part of world cultures. It's no longer acceptable that you can find objects from Egypt in one of the main cloisters of the quadrangle, but have to kind of work your way behind the bins, behind the hedge and up the stairs to find materials from Indigenous Australia. And I think we realise that new statement in the new museum, which I am tremendously proud to be a part. The new museum affords us far more exhibition space, particularly temporary exhibition space, so that we can start to entertain the possibility of bringing collections or temporary exhibitions from other collections to the University of Sydney campus. And one of the big wins is a significant increase in the amount of education space. At the moment, we have one education room that has to serve all school groups and all university tutorials. We're turning people away. To make this museum a laboratory like chemistry, as Stewart said, will be realised through these delivery of education spaces. Over the last 3 years, Candace and Craig and I have been working on developing these exhibitions ready to open in August in the new museum. I've been here almost 3 years now, and I'm tremendously proud of what we've been able to achieve. One of the greatest things of which I'm most proud is our mummy project, building on that done by Suada in the late 1990s, partnering with Macquarie Medical Imaging to generate cutting-edge digital visions on these mummified people, which will provide us digital interactive displays in a dedicated mummy room in the new museum. I'm also proud of the fact that we've been able to generate digital models of artefacts that students are using in their tutorials, looking at the collection in new ways. And of course, delivering a Connections exhibition, which you can still see. The annual Nicholson Lecturer, instigated with the Friends, is one way of making sure we carry that Nicholson name into the new museum. It is an extraordinary journey that we are going on into this new space, and it will be quite a roller coaster ride through this year before we hit the crescendo in August. But friends, on a personal note, this isn't a journey that I will be taking with you after April, as I was offered the position of Curator for Ancient Levant and Anatolia at the British Museum as a senior and permanent post. I have been in the horns of a dilemma over Christmas. It's hard to leave one dream job when there's another dream job, and there's only so many coins you can toss at this point. But I will be making sure with Candace and Craig that all our exhibitions are set to go to this wonderful new space, which I really look forward to coming back and visiting, particularly the new Mummy Room, the Middle East exhibition, which I've been taking the lead on, and the classical and Cypriot exhibitions that Candace and Craig have done such amazing work with. Craig said this is the last formal lecture of in this year's program in our current space. Our farewell party to the Nicholson Museum is the last February in February. The last Wednesday in February, which we will hold in the gallery. One of the reasons why we've moved this quite late today is the fact that the air conditioning unit in the Nicholson decided to give up the ghost this morning. It was 30 degrees without 100 people. We thought we could possibly kill you if we held it there. It will be fixed by the time we have our Nicholson party. Please join us for this celebration. It will be a tremendous event to celebrate this extraordinary 160 years of continued research, education and curation in the current space, and a recognition of how we can expand and make that sing in the new Chow Chak Wing Museum come August. Thank you very much.